The clock struck midnight, and the town of Willowbrook lay cloaked in silence, the kind that pressed against the ears and filled the air with an unnameable weight. Emily sat by her bedroom window, the faint hum of her desk lamp the only sound in the room. She had always loved this time of night, the world stripped bare, secretive, and still. It felt safe, until tonight. She had been thumbing through a well-worn novel when the glow caught her eye. Across the street, where the shadow of the old courthouse fell heavy against the cobblestones, a light flickered unnaturally. It wasn't the steady beam of a street lamp or the warm glow of a window. This was erratic, pulsing, as if alive. Emily leaned closer, her breath fogging the glass as she tried to discern its source. The courthouse had been abandoned for years, its windows boarded up and its doors chained shut. Yet tonight, she saw movement, quick, jagged motions that didn't belong to anything human. Her hand hovered over her phone, hesitating. What would she say? That she had seen a shadow move? That a light flickered in a building where no light should be? She lowered the phone, feeling foolish. Maybe it was just an animal, or a trick of the light. But as her gaze returned to the courthouse, the flickering stopped. The light went out, leaving behind only the empty blackness of the structure. Emily's chest tightened. The world outside felt different, heavier somehow, as if the night itself was leaning closer. And then she saw it. A figure emerged from the courthouse, moving with a strange, deliberate grace. It was tall and thin, draped in shadows that clung to it unnaturally. Its face was obscured, a smudge of blackness that seemed to drink in the faint moonlight. It paused at the top of the courthouse steps, turning its head slowly toward her window. Emily froze. She felt its gaze, a cold weight pressing against her chest, though she couldn't see its eyes. She didn't dare move, her fingers gripping the edge of the windowsill so tightly they ached. The figure raised an arm, long and unnaturally bent, and pointed directly at her. She gasped, stumbling back from the window. Her heart thundered in her ears as she scrambled to the light switch, flooding the room with artificial brightness. For a moment, she stood frozen, her breath shallow, her mind racing. Summoning her courage, she edged back toward the window, peeking out from behind the curtain. The street was empty. No shadowy figure, no flickering light. Just the empty courthouse and the silent street. But the air in her room felt colder, the silence more oppressive. And somewhere deep in her chest, Emily knew she had seen something she was not meant to see. The morning light brought no comfort. Emily's unease lingered like a shadow, darkening even the brightest corners of her apartment. The events of the previous night played on a loop in her mind, the flicker of the courthouse light, the figure, the way it had pointed at her as if marking her. Determined to regain a sense of normalcy, she grabbed her coat and headed into town. Willowbrook's streets were always quiet, the kind of picturesque calm that lured city folks into thinking they'd stumbled upon paradise. But today, the calm felt wrong. The bakery, her first stop every Saturday, was shuttered, its windows dark. Emily frowned. Mr. Abernathy never closed, not even for holidays. She pressed on toward the coffee shop, only to find its doors locked and a hastily scrawled sign taped to the glass. Closed for unforeseen circumstances. A faint chill crept up her spine. It wasn't just the businesses. The streets themselves seemed altered. Landmarks she had known for years felt skewed, as if she were viewing them through a distorted lens. The familiar fountain in the town square seemed farther from its usual spot. The street signs looked older, their paint chipped and faded in ways she didn't remember. The unease only grew as she approached the police station. Emily hesitated at the door, staring at her reflection in the glass. She looked pale, worn, but she needed answers, or at least reassurance that her imagination had run wild the night before. Inside, the station was eerily quiet. The receptionist's desk was vacant, the waiting area empty save for a flickering fluorescent light overhead. Emily called out, her voice echoing faintly. "Hello? Is anyone here?" Silence. The hum of a phone startled her. She followed the sound to a desk at the far end of the room, the receiver vibrating in its cradle. Instinctively, she picked it up. "Hello?" For a moment, there was only static. Then a voice crackled through, faint and distorted. "You shouldn't have looked." Her blood ran cold. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The line went dead. Emily slammed the receiver down, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She backed away, her mind racing. Was this a prank? A coincidence? Or had the figure from last night somehow followed her here? As she stepped outside, the world felt wrong again. The streets were empty, the air unnaturally still. And when she tried to cross back to her car, the crosswalk was gone, vanished as if it had never been there. Her car, too, was missing. Emily turned in circles, her pulse hammering in her throat. The town had become a maze, the familiar twisted into the unfamiliar. And as the shadows stretched long in the late afternoon sun, she realized with dawning horror, she wasn't sure if she could find her way home. Emily hurried through the distorted streets of Willowbrook, her breath clouding in the chilly afternoon air. Her once familiar town was now a strange, alien landscape. The comforting signs of normal life, neighbors chatting on porches, the smell of bread baking from the bakery, had vanished, leaving an unsettling void in their place. She paused at a corner, gripping the strap of her bag to steady herself. There was no one around, no cars, no distant hum of life. Even the sound of birds had gone. She felt utterly alone. The courthouse loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the gray sky. Emily's stomach churned as she stared at its boarded windows and cracked facade. It felt alive, somehow watching her. A low whisper broke the silence. "Emily!" Her heart jolted. She spun around, searching for the source. The street behind her was empty, but the voice, soft, insistent, lingered like a breath against her ear. "Emily, you saw..." She stumbled back, her pulse pounding in her ears. The whispers grew, layering over one another in an incomprehensible chorus that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Shadows along the buildings stretched unnaturally, their edges flickering like a flame caught in a draft. Her feet moved before her mind could process, carrying her down the nearest alley. She didn't care where it led, so long as it was away from the courthouse and the whispers. The alley twisted, its walls narrowing until they seemed to press inward. The air grew colder, tinged with the faint scent of damp earth. Suddenly, Emily stopped. The alley ended in a blank wall, its surface jagged and uneven as though hastily constructed. She turned to retrace her steps, but the entrance was gone. The alley had closed behind her, leaving her trapped in a dead end that hadn't existed moments ago. Panic clawed at her chest as she pressed her hands against the walls, seeking some hidden escape. "This isn't real," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's not real." A shadow shifted at the edge of her vision. She froze, her back pressed against the cold brick. The shadow slid along the wall, its form twisting and rippling unnaturally. It was tall and thin, like the figure she'd seen at the courthouse, but it had no substance, no anchor to the world around it. It stopped just feet away, its head tilting as though studying her. "Why are you doing this?" Emily demanded, her voice cracking. The shadow didn't respond. Instead, it stretched upward, its form flickering like smoke caught in the wind. From within its depth, a faint light pulsed, a glow that felt cold, invasive, as though it were reaching into her very thoughts. And then it spoke. "Leave, but never forget." Emily felt the words reverberate through her, a sensation more than sound. Her body tensed, and for a moment she thought she would collapse under the weight of their meaning. But when she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the alley. She stood in the middle of Willowbrook's town square. The world was quiet once more, but the courthouse still loomed nearby, its shadow stretched long across the cobblestones. The whispers were gone, but their presence lingered in the heavy, charged air. Emily turned and ran. The town faded behind her as Emily followed the winding road toward Willowbrook's lighthouse. It stood on a cliff at the edge of town, a relic of the past when ships once navigated the jagged coastline. It hadn't been in use for decades, but she felt an undeniable pull toward it, a silent urge that whispered of answers. The road narrowed as it climbed, the pavement cracked and uneven. The trees flanking the path grew gnarled and oppressive, their twisted branches reaching toward her like skeletal hands. Emily kept her eyes forward, her breath coming in shallow bursts. When she reached the lighthouse, she hesitated at its base. The structure was weathered and imposing, its white paint flaked away to reveal gray stone beneath. The door hung ajar, swaying faintly in the breeze. She stepped inside. The air was damp and smelled of salt and mildew. A spiral staircase wound upward, its metal steps corroded with rust. The interior was dim, lit only by the faint light streaming through the narrow windows. Emily ascended cautiously, her footsteps echoing in the hollow space. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of unseen eyes pressing against her back. At the top of the stairs, she emerged into the lantern room. The massive glass panes offered a panoramic view of the coastline, but the horizon seemed wrong, blurred, as if smeared by an unseen hand. At the room's center stood an ancient pedestal. Atop it was an object she hadn't expected, a mirror. The mirror was framed in tarnished silver, its surface dark and opaque like the still surface of a deep pond. As Emily approached, the air grew colder, and the faint hum of whispers returned. She hesitated, her reflection wavering in the dark glass. Her face appeared distorted, her features stretched and hollow. "What are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The mirror rippled, and her reflection vanished, replaced by a scene that made her blood run cold. She saw herself standing at the courthouse, staring up at its boarded windows. Behind her, the shadowy figure loomed, its arm outstretched. "You saw," a voice echoed from the mirror, "and now you are part of it." Emily stepped back, her heart hammering in her chest. "Part of what?" she demanded. The mirror darkened, its surface swirling with shadows. "Time will tell." The room filled with a sudden, blinding light, and Emily shielded her eyes. When the light faded, the mirror was gone, and so was her reflection in the glass panes of the lighthouse. Emily staggered out of the lighthouse, her legs trembling as if the earth itself had betrayed her footing. The pale afternoon sun offered no warmth, its light weak and watery, as though filtered through a veil of ash. The whispers had faded, but their weight clung to her skin like cold mist. The road back to Willowbrook seemed longer, the trees darker, their twisted branches clutching at the sky. The lighthouse loomed behind her, a silent sentinel, its shadow stretching unnaturally far despite the sun's position. She didn't dare look back. When Emily reached her apartment, the world felt wrong in a way she couldn't articulate. The air tasted faintly metallic, and the colors of her surroundings were dim, as if someone had drained them of vibrancy. She climbed the stairs to her second-floor unit with leaden feet, each step echoing unnaturally in the empty stairwell. Inside, the stillness was oppressive. The familiar objects of her life, her books, her photos, her carefully curated decor, seemed alien, like they belonged to someone else. She closed the door behind her, locking it out of habit, though she knew instinctively it wouldn't keep them out. The window by her desk drew her gaze like a magnet. Her breath caught as she approached, her hand trembling as she reached to pull the curtain aside. She froze, inches from the fabric. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to stop, to leave it closed, to turn away. But the compulsion to look was stronger. Slowly, Emily parted the curtain. Outside, Willowbrook looked empty. The streets were devoid of cars and people. The buildings stood silent, their windows dark. But it wasn't the emptiness that made her stomach churn. It was the way the town seemed to ripple, as though the world beyond the glass were a reflection on the surface of water. Her gaze drifted toward the courthouse. It stood unchanged, its shadow unnaturally long and sharp, cutting across the cobblestones like a crack in the world. And then she saw it, the figure. It stood motionless at the base of the courthouse steps, its form shrouded in shadows so deep they seemed to devour the light around it. It didn't move, but Emily could feel its attention fixed on her, an invisible thread pulling taut between them. A cold, trembling breath escaped her lips. "What do you want?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, the window itself seemed to change. The glass shimmered, faint ripples spreading across its surface like a disturbed pond. Emily leaned closer, compelled despite the growing dread clawing at her chest. Her reflection began to shift. At first, it mimicked her movements perfectly, her pale face staring back in wide-eyed terror. But then it stopped following her. Emily's breath hitched as her reflection stood still, its gaze fixed on her even as she took a step back. The reflection smiled. It was a slow, deliberate movement, the corners of its mouth pulling upward into a grin that was anything but human. Her legs buckled, and she clutched the windowsill for support, her gaze locked on the impossible sight. The reflection raised its hand, pressing its palm against the glass. Emily stared in horror as a faint shadow began to spread from the contact point, dark veins spidering outward across the surface of the window. The reflection leaned closer, its grin widening until it seemed to stretch too far, splitting its face unnaturally. "Let me in," it whispered, its voice low and distorted, like a faint echo from a cavern. Emily staggered back, her heart hammering against her ribs. The glass shimmered again, the dark veins pulsating as the reflection's hand pressed harder, as though it were testing the barrier. "No," she breathed, shaking her head. "You can't. You're not real." The grin faltered for the briefest moment, replaced by something far worse, a look of knowing. The reflection tilted its head, as though amused by her defiance. "You looked," it said, its voice softer now, almost gentle. "And now, you're mine." The window shattered, not with a sound, but with a sudden absence of glass. The frame was empty, yet beyond it, Emily no longer saw the distorted streets of Willowbrook. She saw the courthouse. Its dark shadow consumed everything, stretching into a void where the world should have been. The figure was gone, but its presence lingered, pressing against her chest, her mind. Emily stumbled away from the window, her back hitting the far wall. The empty frame stared at her, an open mouth waiting to swallow her whole. The air in her apartment thickened, the walls closing in, their edges blurring. And then she realized the window wasn't watching her. It was reflecting her. The scene beyond it began to shift, mirroring her room in perfect detail. But it wasn't her room. In the reflection, the shadows were deeper, alive, curling and twisting along the edges. Her reflection stood at the center, grinning that impossibly wide grin, waiting. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling every corner of the apartment. And Emily understood. She had seen what she wasn't meant to see, glimpsed into a world that thrived in the spaces between light and shadow. And now, it wanted her to join it. As the whispers crescendoed, Emily's vision blurred, the world around her dissolving into darkness. And in the empty frame of the window, her reflection smiled,